I want to tell you something I have never told anyone in quite this way. Not because I am ashamed, not anymore, but because it took me a long time to find the right words. And even now, sitting here with a cup of tea going cold beside me, I am not entirely sure the words will come out straight. But I will try. That is, after all, what this whole story is about, trying when trying feels impossible. My name is Daniel. I am 38 years old. I work in logistics coordination for a mid-sized freight company, which means I spend most of my days managing things that go wrong for other people. Delayed shipments, missed deadlines, phone calls from vendors who are polite in the way that people are polite when they are barely holding their frustration together. I am good at the job. I have been told that. I have a plaque on my desk that says Employee of the Quarter, which sounds impressive until you realize the quarter in question was during a pandemic when half the team was on leave, and I was the only one showing up every day, quietly holding everything together while quietly falling apart. That is, I think, where the story really starts. Not with my wife, Priya. Not with the corset. Not with any single dramatic moment. It starts somewhere quieter and more ordinary, in the slow accumulation of a life that felt like it was happening to me rather than being lived by me. Priya and I had been married for 9 years at that point. We met in graduate school, fell in love over bad coffee and worse deadlines, and built a life together that was, by most reasonable measures, a good one. A small house in a quiet neighborhood. 2 cats named after philosophers, Hume and Spinoza, who spent most of their time ignoring us from separate armchairs. Friends we genuinely liked. Dinners that were sometimes cooked from scratch and sometimes ordered from the Thai place on the corner that knew our order by heart. But somewhere in the middle of all that comfortable good life, I had stopped feeling like myself. I could not have told you when it happened. That is the insidious thing about gradual erosion. You do not notice the shoreline changing until one day you look around and realize you are standing somewhere you do not recognize. I was anxious. Chronically, quietly, exhaustingly anxious. The kind of anxious that does not announce itself with panic attacks or dramatic episodes, but instead sits in your chest like a low-grade hum, present in every room, every conversation, every moment when you catch your own reflection in a darkened window and feel a strange, uncomfortable distance from the person looking back. I had gained weight. Not dramatically, but enough that my clothes felt like they belonged to a slightly different version of me. I slouched. I noticed sometimes that I would enter a room and make myself smaller, pull my shoulders in, drop my gaze, take up less space. Not because anyone asked me to, just because it had become habit. The habit of a person who has spent years managing other people's expectations and forgotten how to manage his own sense of self. Priya noticed. She is perceptive that way. Notices things without making a performance of noticing them. She did not sit me down and deliver a concerned speech. She is not that kind of person. What she did was something altogether more unexpected. It was a Saturday morning in October. The light through the kitchen window was the color of weak tea, and I was standing at the counter in an old sweatshirt, staring at the toaster without really seeing it. She came in, poured herself a coffee, looked at me for a moment, and said, in the most matter-of-fact tone imaginable, "I think you should try on my corset." I turned around. I stared at her. She was already reading something on her phone. "I'm serious," she said, without looking up. "Not for anything weird. Just, I think you might find it interesting. I think it might help." I had about 12 different responses to that, ranging from confusion to defensiveness to the kind of embarrassed laugh that people produce when they do not know how else to react. I cycled through all of them internally in approximately 4 seconds and then said, out loud, the only honest thing I could think of. "Help with what?" She put her phone down and looked at me with that expression she has, the one that is patient and precise and somehow makes you feel both seen and a little bit exposed. "With feeling like yourself again," she said. And I did not have an answer for that, because she was right that something needed to help. And I was too tired that morning to pretend otherwise. It did not happen immediately. That is important to say. I did not try it that morning and have some cinematic transformation. Life does not work that way. And this story is about real life. What happened was that Priya left the corset on the edge of the bathroom counter the following Tuesday morning and said nothing about it. Just left it there. A deep burgundy satin, boned and laced at the back, the kind of garment that looks structured and serious even when it is sitting still. It had been hers from a vintage fair she had visited years ago, something she had bought on impulse and worn twice before deciding it was not quite her thing. It had been living in a box on the shelf ever since. I looked at it while I brushed my teeth. Then I got in the shower. Then I got out of the shower and stood there dripping, looking at it again, with the particular self-consciousness of a person about to do something that feels both ridiculous and significant, and they're not sure which feeling to trust. I picked it up. It was heavier than I expected. Structured. The boning gave it a rigid, considered quality, as though it had opinions about posture. I read the lacing mechanism for a moment, worked it out, and, standing alone in a quiet bathroom with the cats presumably asleep and the morning light coming in through the frosted glass, I put it on. Getting the lacing right took time. I had to look it up on my phone, which felt absurd and also oddly practical. When I finally had it adjusted reasonably well, I stood up straight, and something happened. It was not magical. I want to be clear about that. It did not feel like a movie. It felt like pressure. A firm, even deliberate pressure around my torso, not painful, but present in a way that was impossible to ignore. It held me. That is the only word that fits. It held me in a way that required me, instinctively, to respond. My shoulders went back. My spine lengthened. My chin came up. Not because I decided those things should happen, but because the garment created a physical context in which slumping was simply not an option. It was like being very quietly, but firmly reminded of something. I stood there for probably 3 minutes. Just stood there, looking at myself in the mirror. I looked different. Not transformed. Not unrecognizable. But the posture changed something in the face, too. I looked more deliberate. More composed. Like someone who was present in their own body, rather than a reluctant tenant. I took it off before I left for work. I had not decided anything. I was not ready to decide anything. But that evening, when I sat down at the dinner table and Priya asked how my day had been, I said, honestly and, to my own mild surprise, interesting, actually. She smiled into her pasta and did not ask anything else. That was the right call. In the days that followed, I found myself thinking about it more than I expected. Not with anxiety or confusion, but with a kind of quiet, persistent curiosity. The physical sensation of it. The way it had, without any words or effort or performance, simply corrected my posture, and in doing so corrected something in my bearing, something in the way I inhabited the space around me. I tried it again the following Friday morning, and then again the following Monday. Each time alone. Each time quiet. I started to understand the lacing better. Started to find the right tension. Not tight enough to be restrictive, but present enough to be a reminder. I began to think of it less as a garment and more as a kind of physical anchor. There was also something about the ritual of it. The deliberateness. The act of choosing to put on something that required attention, that required you to be present in your own body in order to do it correctly. I had spent so long operating on automatic, getting dressed, eating, commuting, working, returning, that the small, careful intentionality of this was like waking a muscle I had forgotten I had. Priya and I talked about it eventually, not dramatically. One evening she asked if I had tried it, and I said yes a few times. She asked how it felt. I thought about it for a moment and said, like being told to stand up straight, but nicely. She laughed. Then she asked if I wanted to try some of her other things sometime, and I said I did not know yet, and she said that was fine, and that was the entire conversation. Which was, it turned out, exactly the right amount of conversation for that stage of things. The thing about small changes is that they compound. That is the part no one talks about because it sounds boring. People want the dramatic turn, the single moment of revelation. Real change is quieter than that. It is made of Tuesdays. Over the following weeks, I began to build something that I can only describe as a morning practice. It sounds grandiose when I call it that. It was not. It was simple and private and a little awkward at first, in the way that any new habit is before it becomes natural. I started getting up 20 minutes earlier. Not to do anything productive in the conventional sense. Just to have 20 minutes that were mine before the day began making demands. I would make tea, proper tea, not the bag-and-mug shortcut I usually made in a rush, and sit with it by the window for a few minutes before anything else. Just that. Just sitting with tea, watching the light change, not thinking about shipping routes or vendor calls or any of it. Then, on certain mornings, the corset. Not every morning. That was not the point. But on mornings when I felt the familiar heaviness settling in, the low-grade dread, the sense of being already behind, already inadequate, I would take it out and put it on for 30 minutes or so while I did the ordinary things. Made breakfast. Read. Moved through the kitchen with, if I am being precise, a kind of quiet dignity that I had not felt in my own body for a long time. I began to notice other things shifting alongside it. I started paying more attention to how I dressed generally. Not expensively. I was not suddenly buying things. Just more thoughtfully. Taking an extra minute to choose something that fit properly, that I actually liked rather than just reached for. The connection felt obvious once I saw it. The corset had reminded me that clothing is not neutral. It talks to your body, and your body talks back. Wearing something that makes you feel composed affects, actually and measurably, how composed you feel. I started walking differently. This sounds small. It was not small. Posture is not a cosmetic concern. It affects breathing, which affects mood, which affects every interaction you have, and every thought you think. When I stand with my spine straight, and my weight distributed properly and my head level, I think differently. I respond differently. I am less reactive, less easily rattled. I had known this intellectually for years. It took a piece of structured satin to teach it to my body. At work, people started asking if I had done something different. Got a haircut, they usually assumed. Started exercising. Something visible that would explain the change. I would say yes, something like that, and leave it there, which was accurate enough. What was actually happening was more interior. I was learning, or perhaps relearning, that the way you inhabit your body is a choice you make many times a day, in many small ways. And that making it consciously, even in small ways, even just in the way you stand at the coffee machine or the way you settle into your chair before a difficult phone call, accumulates into something real. I started keeping a small notebook. Not a journal in any serious sense. I am not a journal person. Just notes. Brief observations. Things like, put it on this morning. Stood straighter through the whole breakfast. Noticed I wasn't hunching during the 11 o'clock call. Dry, factual things, but useful. A record that something was actually changing. Evidence I could return to on days when it felt like nothing was. Priya noticed the change, of course. She noticed it in ways she did not always name. The small things. I was present at dinner in a way I had not been for a while, actually there, actually listening rather than sitting with my body at the table and my mind still at the office. I laugh more easily. I was, I think, easier to be with. One evening she said, simply and without preamble, "You seem more like yourself lately." I thought about that for a moment. Then I said, "I think I'm figuring out what that means." She nodded. She understood. This is one of the gifts of a long marriage. Sometimes the most important conversations are mostly silence. I want to try to explain something that is harder to articulate than the practical details. The mornings, the posture, the ritual. Those are the visible surface of something that was happening underneath, something I had to spend some time understanding before I could talk about it honestly. The anxiety I had been carrying for years was, at its root, a loss of agency. Not in any dramatic or traumatic sense. Nothing catastrophic had happened to me. But I had spent so long managing other people's needs, other people's timelines, other people's crises, that I had slowly lost the habit of being the author of my own experience. I was reacting constantly to work, to expectations, to the undefined but persistent sense that I was somehow falling short of something, though I could never quite name what. The corset, and the wider practice of deliberate self-care that grew around it, was a way of reclaiming authorship, of making a choice, every morning, about how I wanted to inhabit the day. It was, in a way I had not expected and could not have predicted, an act of will. A quiet, private, entirely personal declaration that I was going to be intentional about how I existed in my own life. I am aware that this might sound strange. A man in his late 30s putting on a corset in a private bathroom and calling it an act of self-determination. I understand how that reads. But the strangeness of it was, in retrospect, part of what made it work. It was outside the script. It did not fit neatly into any category of things men are supposed to do to feel better about themselves. It was not going to the gym, not adopting a productivity system, not reading a particular book. It was something more particular, more personal, more entirely mine. And that particularity was the point. There is something important that happens when you do something that is genuinely, specifically you, even if it is unexpected, even if it defies simple explanation. You recognize yourself. And for someone who had spent years feeling like a stranger in his own life, recognition was not a small thing. I also want to say something about what the experience was not. It was not about escaping who I was. It was not about performing a different identity or pretending to be something I was not. It was, paradoxically, the opposite of escape. It was a way of arriving. The structure of the garment, the physical insistence of it, brought me into my body rather than letting me float away from it. It made me present. And presence, I had come to understand, was what I had been missing. The anxiety lives in the future and the past, in the call you have not yet made, the mistake you have already made, the deadline approaching, the expectation you might not meet. It does not live in the present, in the weight of satin against your ribs and the straightness of your own spine, and the quiet of a morning before everything else begins. I talked to a therapist for a while during this period. Not because of the corset, she was not consulted about that specifically, but because I had decided, for perhaps the first time in my adult life, to take my interior experience seriously. To treat it as something worth attention rather than something to manage and suppress and push through. She was helpful. She described what I was building as a grounding practice, a set of physical and behavioral anchors that pulled me into the present moment. She did not know about the specifics, but she said, more than once, that whatever I was doing seemed to be working and to keep doing it. The self-doubt did not vanish.
I want to be honest about that.
It did not disappear on some golden morning and never return. What changed was my relationship to it. I stopped treating it as evidence. It would show up, the familiar voice saying you are behind, you are inadequate, you're not quite managing this. And instead of accepting that voice as authoritative, I learned to recognize it as a habit. Old weather. The kind of weather you put on a coat for and walk through anyway. The coat, in my case, was sometimes literal. Or rather, it was a corset. And the walking through was the day. I am telling you this story from a distance of about 14 months, which means I have had enough time to see it clearly, and not so much time that it has softened into comfortable myth. Here is where things stand. I am still in logistics. I still deal with delayed shipments and vendor calls, and the particular exhaustion of managing other people's problems all day. That has not changed, and I do not expect it to. What has changed is how I arrive at those things. The difference between walking into a difficult conversation already contracted, already braced, already defeated, and walking into it upright and grounded and present. I still have the corset. I wear it maybe 2 or 3 times a week, usually in the mornings, usually when I know the day ahead is going to require something extra. It has become what I suppose it always was, a tool, a physical anchor, a way of saying before the day has a chance to say otherwise, that I am here, I am deliberate, I am not going to be flattened by this. Priya and I talk about it openly now, in the easy way we talk about most things after 9 years. She finds it genuinely interesting, in a practical and unsentimental way. She bought herself a new corset last spring, and we spent a Sunday afternoon in the kitchen with tea and a YouTube tutorial, both of us figuring out the lacing. Spinoza sat on the counter and judged us. It was, all things considered, a very good afternoon. The wider self-care practice has stuck in ways I did not anticipate. The morning 20 minutes. The proper tea. The attention to how I dress. The notebook, which has grown into something more substantial than brief observations, something closer to a record of my own thinking, my own noticing, my own presence in my life. These are small things. I know they are small, but they are mine, and they have made the larger things more manageable, more meaningful, more mine as well. I want to be careful here not to suggest that I arrived somewhere perfect. I did not. Perfection was never the destination, and I have learned to be suspicious of it as a concept. What I arrived at was something more durable than perfection, a sense of sufficiency, the sense that I am enough to do this.
To do the day.
To be present in my marriage, in my work, in my own body. Not triumphantly enough. Not effortlessly enough. Just enough. The self-doubt visits still. The anxiety hums sometimes. There are mornings when the weight of the week ahead feels very heavy and the 20 minutes of quiet tea feels inadequate against it. On those mornings, I lace the corset a little more carefully. I stand in front of the mirror for an extra moment. I remind myself, without drama, that I have done this before and I will do it again. There is a specific posture that happens when you are wearing something structured and properly fitted. Your chest opens. Your breathing deepens. Your center of gravity feels lower and steadier. You occupy your body differently, not larger, necessarily, but more fully. Like you are actually living in all the rooms of yourself, rather than hovering anxiously near the exit. That is what I have been working toward. Not a transformation. Not a reinvention. Just that, full occupancy. Being genuinely, completely present in the life I already have. I think about the version of me standing at the kitchen counter in the old sweatshirt, staring at the toaster with that hollow, mechanical exhaustion, and I feel, mostly, a quiet compassion for him. He was doing his best with what he had. He just needed something to remind him that the choice to be present was available to him, that he could make it. The reminder came, as it happens, in the form of a burgundy satin corset with boning and a lacing that took me 3 tries to get right. Which is perhaps not the most conventional path to self-understanding. But I have come to believe that the conventional paths are overrated. What matters is that you find something that reaches you, that gets through the noise and the habit and the armor, and says, here. Stand here. Stand straight. You have more in you than you think. I had more in me than I thought. I think probably so do you.